Fedor had a healed-over scrape on the side of his temple that morning. He knocked it against one of the ribs of a radiator and, hastily recovering the top toothpaste tube, which had rolled underneath it, suddenly breaking off his speech, Chernyshevsky pointed squeamishly and anxiously at his temple. "Was haben Sie da?" he asked, with a grimace of pain, and then smiled unpleasantly, and, growing more and more angry and agitated, began to say that you could not get by him, and he had recognized right away, he said, a recent suicide. The attendant came up to Fedor and asked him to leave, and walking through the funerally luxuriant garden, past unctuous beds in which bass-toned dark crimson dahlias were blooming in blessed sleep and eternal repose, toward the bench where he was awaited by Madame Chernyshevsky, who never went in to her husband, but spent whole days in the immediate vicinity of his quarters, preoccupied, brisk, always with packages, walking over to the variegated gravel between myrtle shrubs, resembling furniture, and taking the visitors he passed for paranoiacs. Troubled, Fedor kept pondering over the fact that the misfortune of the Chernyshevskys appeared to be a kind of mocking variation on the theme of his own hope-suffused grief, and only much later did he understand the full refinement of the corollary and all the irreproachable compositional balance with which these collateral sounds had been included in his own life. 3 days before his mother's departure, in a large hall which was very known to Berlin Russians and which belonged to a society which belonged to a society of dentists, judging by the portraits of venerable tooth doctors that looked down from the walls, an open literary evening was held in which Fedor Konstantinovich also took part. Few people had turned up, and it was cold. By the doors, the same 1,000 times seen representatives of the local Russian intelligentsia stood around smoking, and as usual catching sight of some familiar friendly face, Fedor hurried toward it with sincere pleasure, only to have it replaced by boredom after the first burst of conversation. Elizaveta Pavlovna was joined in by the first row of Madame Chernyshevsky, and from the fact that his mother occasionally turned her head this way and that while adjusting her hairdo from behind, Fedor, hovering about the hall, concluded that she was a little interested in the society of her neighbor. At last the program began. First to read was a name-writer who in this time had appeared in all the Russian reviews, a gray-haired, clean-shaven old man, rather resembling a hoopoe, with eyes which were too good-natured for literature. In a sensibly everyday kind of voice, he read a tale of Petersburg life on the eve of the Revolution, with an either-sniffing vamp, chic spies, champagne, Rasputin, and apoplectic sunsets over the Neva. After him, a certain Krom, writing under the pseudonym of Rostislav the Strange, gladdened us with a long story about a romantic adventure in the town of 100 Eyes, beneath skies unknown, for the sake of beauty, with epithets were placed after the nouns, his verbs also flown off somewhere or other, and for some reason the word Strozhko warily was repeated about a dozen times. She warily let fall a smile. The chestnuts broke warily into blossom. After the interval, poets came thick and fast, a tall youth with a button-like face, another shortish with a large nose, an elderly lady wearing a pince-nez, another younger one, and finally Konchiev, who, in contrast to the triumphant precision and polish of the others, muttered his verses in a low, tired voice, but there dwelt independently in them such music in the seemingly dark verse as a chasm of meaning yawned at one's feet. So convincing were the sounds, and so unexpectedly out of the very same words every poet was stringing together, there sprang up, played, slipped away without ever quenching one's thirst, a unique perfection bearing no resemblance to words, and in no need of words, that for the first time that evening the applause was not faint. Last to appear was Goodmanov Sherdintsev. And the poems written during the summer he read those which Elizaveta Pavlovna liked so much in Russia, the yellow birches mute in the blue sky, and on Berlin, beginning with the stanza, "Things here are in a starry state. Even the moon is much too rough, though it is rumored to come straight from Hamburg, where they make the stuff." And the one which moved her most of all, although she did not think to connect it with the memory of a young woman long dead whom Fedor had loved when 16, One night between sunset and river, when the old bridge we stood, you and I. Will you ever forget it? I queried, that particular swift that went by, and you answered so earnestly, never. And what sobs made us suddenly shiver, what a cry of life emitted in flight. Till we die, till tomorrow, forever. You and I on the old bridge one night. But it was getting late. Many people were moving toward the exit. One lady was putting on her coat with her back to the platform. The applause was sparse. The damp night gleamed black in the street with a raging wind. Never, never will we reach home. But nonetheless a tram came, and hanging on a strap in the gangway over his mother sitting by the window, Fedor thought with heavy revulsion of the verses he had written that day, of word fissures, of the leakage of poetry, and at the same time with proud joyous energy, with passionate impatience, he was already looking down for the creation of something new, something still unknown, genuine, corresponding fully to the gift which he felt like a burden inside himself. On the eve of her departure, they both sat up late in his room, she in her armchair easily and skillfully, whereas formerly she could not sew a button on, darning and mending his pitiful things, while he on the sofa, biting his nails, was reading a thick, battered book. Earlier in his youth he had skipped some of the pages. Angelo journeyed to Azram, but later it was precisely in these that he had found particular pleasure. He had only just got the words, "Frontier held something serious for me. To travel had been my favorite dream since childhood," when suddenly he felt a sweet, strong stab from somewhere else. Still not understanding, he put the book to one side and slipped blind fingers into a box full of homemade cigarettes. At that moment his mother said without raising her head, "What did I just remember? Those funny rhymes about butterflies and moths which you and he composed together when we were out walking. You remember? Your blue-striped cato-colored slow shows from under its gray lid." "Yes," replied Fedor, "some were downright epics. A dead leaf is not hoarier than a newborn arborea." What a surprise it had been! Father had only just brought back the very first specimen from his travels, having found it during the initial trek through Siberia. He had not even had time to describe it yet, and on the first day after his return, in Leshino Park, 2 paces from the house, with no thought of Lepidoptera, while strolling with his wife and children, throwing a tennis ball for the fox terriers, basking in his return and the balcony weather and the health and gaiety of his family, but unconsciously noting with the experienced eye of a hunter every insect along his path, he had suddenly pointed out to Fedor with the tip of his cane a plump reddish-gray Epigoptera moth, with sinuate margins of the leaf-mimicking kind, hanging asleep from a stalk under a bush. He had been about to walk on. The members of this genus looked very much alike, and then squatted down, wrinkled his forehead, inspected his spine, and suddenly said in a bright voice, "Well, Andard, I need not have gone so far." "I always said so," interposed his wife, in the laugh. The furry little monster in his hand belonged to the new species he had just brought back, and now it had cropped up here in the province of St. Petersburg, whose fauna had been so well investigated. But as often happens, the momentum of mighty coincidence did not stop there. It was good for one more stage. Only a few days later his father learned that this moth had just been described from St. Petersburg specimens by a fellow scientist, and Fedor cried all night long. They had beaten father to it, and now Elizaveta Pavlovna was about to return to Paris. They stood for a long time on the narrow platform waiting for the train next to the luggage elevator, while on the other lines the sad city trains stopped for a moment, hastily banging their doors. The Paris express rushed in. His mother boarded and immediately thrust her head through the window, smiling, but the neighboring opulent sleeping car, seeing off an unpretentious old lady, stood a couple of pale red-lipped beauty in a black silk coat with a high fur collar and a famous stunt flyer. Everyone was staring at him and his muffler at his back, as if expecting to find wings on it. "I have a suggestion to make," said his mother gaily as they parted. "I have about 70 marks left, which are quite useless to me, and you must eat better. I can't look at you, you're so thin. Here, take them." "Avec joie," he replied, instantly envisioning up years past to the state library, milk chocolate, and some mercenary young German girl whom, in his baser moments, he kept planning to get for himself. Pensive, abstracted, vaguely tormented by the thought that somehow in his talks with his mother he had left the main thing untold, Fedor returned home, took off his shoes, broke off the corner of a chocolate bar together with silver paper, moved the book left and open on the sofa closer. The harvest rippled, awaiting the sickle, Again that divine stab, and how it called, how it prompted him, the sentence about the Terek. In faith, the river was awesome, or even more intimately about the Tartar women. They were sitting on horseback, swathed in yashmaks. All one could see were their eyes and the heels of their shoes. Thus did he hearken to the purest sound from Pushkin's tuning fork, and he already knew exactly what this sound required of him. 2 weeks after his mother's departure, he wrote her about what he had conceived, what he had been helped to conceive by the transparent rhythm of Arzurum, and she replied as if she had already known about it. It is a long time since I have been happy as I was with you in Berlin, but watch out, this is no easy undertaking. I feel in my heart that you will accomplish it wonderfully, but remember that you need a great deal of exact information and very little family sentimentality. If you need anything, I'll tell you all I can, but take care of the special research where you are, and this is most important. Take all his books and those of Grigory Alfmovich and those of the Grand Duke and lots more, and of course you know how to obtain all this, and be sure to get in touch with Vasily Germanovich Kruger. Search him out if he's still in Berlin. They once traveled together, I remember it. Approach other people. You know whom better than I. Write to Avanov, to Verity. Write to that German who used to visit us before the war. Binhas? Write to Stuttgart, to London, to Treen, to Oxford, everywhere. De Bralatois, because I know nothing of these matters, and all these names merely sing in my ears, but how certain I am that you will manage, my darling. He continued, however, to wait. The planned work was a wafture of bliss, and he was afraid to spoil that bliss by haste, and moreover the complex responsibility of the work frightened him. He was not ready for it yet. Continuing his training program during the whole of spring, he fed on Pushkin and hailed Pushkin. The reader of Pushkin has the capacity of his lungs enlarged. He studied the accuracy of the words and the absolute purity of their conjunction. He carried the transparency of prose to the limits of blank verse, and then mastered it. In this he was served by a living example in the prose of Pushkin's history of the Pugachev rebellion. God help us not to see a Russian riot, senseless and merciless. To strengthen the muscles of his muse, he took on his rambles whole pages of Pugachev, learned by heart as a man using an iron bar instead of a walking stick. Toward him out of Pushkin tale came Carolina Schmidt, a girl heavily rouged of meek and modest appearance, who acquired the bed in which Schoenig died. Beyond Grunwald Forest, a postmaster who resembled Simeon Viren from another tale was lighting his pipe by the window, and there also stood post with balsam flowers. The sky-blue seraphin of the damsel turned peasant could be glimpsed among alder bushes. He was in that state of feeling mind when reality, giving way to fancies, blends with them in the nebulous visions of first sleep. Pushkin entered his blood. With Pushkin's voice merged the voice of his father. He kissed Pushkin's hot little hand, taking it for another large hand, smelling of breakfast kalach, a blonde roll. He remembered that his and Tanya's nurse hailed from the same place that Pushkin's Arina came from, namely Sudya. Just beyond Gachina, this had been within an hour's ride of their area, and she had spoken sing-song-like. He heard his father on a fresh summer morning as they walked down to the river bathing house, on whose plank wall shimmered a golden reflection of the water, repeating with classic fervor that he considered to be the most beautiful, not only of Pushkin's lines, but also of the verses ever written in the world. Tut Apollon ideal, tam noboye bechal. Here is Apollo ideal. There is Niobe grief, and the russet wing of the mother of pearl of a Niobe fritillary flashed over the scabiosas of the riverside meadow, where during the first days of June there occurred sparsely the small black Apollo. Indefatigably in ecstasy, he was really preparing his work now in Berlin with an adjustment of 13 days. It was also the first day of June. Collected material, read until dawn, studied maps, wrote letters, and met with the necessary people. From Pushkin's prose he had passed to his life, so that in the beginning the rhythm of Pushkin's era commingled with the rhythm of his father's life. Scientific books within the Berlin library stamped always on the 99th page, such as the familiar volumes of the Travels of the Naturalist, and unfamiliar black and green bindings lay side by side with the old Russian journals in which he sought Pushkin's reflected light. There one day he stumbled over the remarkable memoirs of the past of A.N. Suhushkov, in which there, among other things, 2 or 3 pages concerning his grandfather, Kirill Ilyich. His father had once referred to them with displeasure. The fact that the writer of these memoirs mentioned him incidentally in connection with his thoughts on Pushkin now seemed somehow to have a particular significance, even though he portrayed Kirill Ilyich as a gay dog and a good-for-nothing. Suhushkov wrote, They say that a man whose leg is cut off at the hip can feel it for a long time, moving non-existent toes and flexing non-existent muscles. Thus will Russia long continue to feel the living presence of Pushkin. There is something seductive like an abyss in his fatal destiny, and indeed he himself felt that he had and would have a special reckoning with fate. In addition to the poet's extracting poetry out of his past, he also found it in tragic thoughts about the future, the triple formula of human existence: irrevocability, unrealizability, inevitability, as well as to him. But how he wanted to live. In the above-mentioned album of My Academic Aunt, he personally wrote a poem which I can remember to this day, both mentally and visually, so that I can even see its position on the page. Oh no, my life has not grown tedious. I want it all. I love it still. My soul, although its youth has vanished, has not become completely chill. Fate will yet comfort me. A novel of genius I shall yet enjoy. I'll see a mature McKidwaits with something I myself may toy. I do not think one would find any other poet who peered so often, now superstitiously or with inspired seriousness into the future. Right to this day there lies the province of Kursk, topping with 100 mark. An old man whom I remember as being already elderly, stupid, and malicious, but Pushkin is no longer with us. Meeting in the course of my long life with remarkable talents and living through remarkable events, I have often meditated on how he would have reacted to this and that, why he would have seen the emancipation of the serfs and could have read Anna Karenina. And returning now to these reveries of mine, I recall at once in my youth I had something of the nature of a vision. The psychological episode is closely linked with the recollection of a personage still thriving to this very day, whom I shall call Chit. I trust he will not blame me for this revival of a distant past. We were acquainted through our families. My grandfather had once been friendly with his father. In 1836, while abroad, this Chit, who was then quite young, barely 17, quarreled with his family, and in so doing hastened, so they say, the decease of his sire, a hero of the Napoleonic War, and in the company of some Hamburg merchants sailed nonchalantly off to Boston, from there landing in Texas, where he successfully took up cattle breeding. In that manner 20 years passed. The fortune he had made he lost playing écarté on Mississippi keelboat, won it back in the gaming houses of the New Orleans, blued it all over again, and after one of those scandalously prolonged, noisy, smoky duels on closed premises which were then fashionable in Louisiana, and after many other adventures, he became homesick for Russia, where, conveniently, a demesne was waiting for him, and with the same carefree easiness with which he had left it, he returned to Europe. Once, on a winter's day in 1858, he visited us unexpectedly at our house on the Moika in St. Petersburg. Father was away, and the guest was received us youngsters. As we looked at his outlandish fop and his soft black hat and black clothes, the romantic gloom of which caused his silk shirt with his sumptuous pleats and his blue lilac and pink waistcoat and diamond buttons to stand out particularly dazzlingly, my brother and I could hardly contain our laughter, and decided there then to take advantage of the fact that during all these years he had heard absolutely nothing of his homeland, as if it had fallen through some trapdoor, so that now, like a 40-year-old Rip Van Winkle, waking up in a transformed St. Petersburg, Chit was hungry for any news, the which he undertook to give him plenty of, mixed with our outrageous fabrications. To the question, for instance, was Pushkin alive, and what was he writing, I blasphemously replied, why, he came out with a new poem the other day. That night we took our guest to the theater. It did not turn out too well, however. Instead of treating him to a new Russian comedy, we showed him Othello with the famous black tragedian Aldrich. At first our American planter seemed to be highly amused by the appearance of on the stage, but he remained indifferent to the marvelous power of his acting, and was more taken up with examining the audience, especially our St. Petersburg ladies, one of whom he soon afterwards married, who were devoured at that moment with envy for Desdemona. Look who's sitting next to us, my brother suddenly said to Chet in a low voice, there to our right. In the neighboring box sat an old man, of shortish stature, in a worn tailcoat, with sallow and swarthy complexion, disheveled ashen side whiskers, and sparse gray-streaked tousled hair. He was taking a most eccentric delight in the acting of this. Thick lips twitched, his nostrils were dilated, and at certain bits he even jumped up and down in his seat and banged with delight on the parapet, his rings flashing. Who's that? Asked Chit. What, you don't recognize him? Look closer. I don't recognize him. Then my brother made big eyes and whispered, Why, that's Pushkin.